this is Grace Maher with OTR Solutions, and I'm here today with Principal Analyst from DAT, Dean Croke.
Yeah.
Dean, thank you so much for joining.
Great to be with you.
Yes.
Thank you.
We had a few questions. You're here this morning talking to the OTR team about 2023 and the market ahead. And as we do that, we want to also take this to our clients and the carriers, the OTR family, and talk a little bit about what they should expect. What would you want our carriers to know specifically going into this next year?
Yeah, we're certainly in the bottom part of this freight cycle, and freight cycles come in, normally maybe 3-year periods. This is a much shorter cycle. The pandemic elongated the highs and the lows, so it's a much tighter turnaround this time. So we're clearly, rates are still heading down, and there's still a lot of trucks in the market. So that's why there's downward pressure on both contract and spot rates for the carriers that are out there. Running in the spot market, rates are still decreasing, albeit kind of feel like they're bottoming out and flatlining, which is a good thing.
Right.
There is some sense that we're at the bottom of the market as we start January. The problem is that this is the quiet season. Right? Normally, this is a quiet time of the year, and there is still a lot of economic uncertainty, consumer confidence issues, rising inflation. The housing market has cooled right off. That's affecting flatbed carriers. So we're still in a precarious situation in the first quarter. I've been saying for a long time that I think this quarter will be quieter than normal. So we've got to make sure we watch that. The flip side is diesel costs are coming down. Now, that's a good thing for carriers because we've seen diesel come down almost $1 per gallon since the peak in July. That's significant, but diesel's still around 72 cents a mile. It's still high. I filled up my truck the other day at $4.70 a gallon. That's about where it was at the worst during the Great Recession in 2008.
Right.
So diesel prices are very high historically. Everybody's costs have gone up. I think shippers and brokers know that. My costs are up about 25 cents a mile in the last year. Most of that's fuel. So fuel's going to be the big thing to watch. There's lots of geopolitical risk from around the world that we've got to watch, and that will determine which way diesel goes. The EIA is very bullish. They are forecasting, an average of about $4.30 this year and down to $3.70 next year.
Would be great.
$3.70 is still high historically for diesel.
High.
The flip side is for carriers in the spot market rates excluding fuel are about 25 cents a mile higher than where they would normally be at the start of January. So rates are still historically high, even though they've come down 70 cents a mile since this time last year. They're still higher than where they'd normally be before the pandemic. So it's a little bit of a wash in that costs are up, but rates are up historically. So it still costs a lot to run a truck. A lot of folks out there are struggling with this because if they're new to the industry and paid a lot more for used trucks and have very high insurance costs, you've still got to focus on cost control and be very creative with what lanes you run right now.
So in talking about that, for the carrier that came into the market a year ago or 2 years ago at historically higher, rates than we've ever seen before, what do you tell the carrier today when they're thinking about rate per mile?
So when I've run truck fleets, I always work on revenue per day. I brought on my P&I, every truck is a P&L, so it's revenue per truck week.
Right.
It's sort of my high number. And then I break it down to revenue per day. And what I say is, what do I need to generate per day? Because the whole world changed when ELDs came in late 2017.
Right.
Because for a lot of small carriers that ran paper logs, there was a lot of flexibility built into your day. You didn't necessarily do more miles, you just did them differently.
Right.
And what that meant was there was a lot more flexibility. You could run different lanes. You could catch up when things were bad. When there was weather delays, you could always play catch up. Since ELDs came in and that clock is ticking for every time you go over 5 miles an hour, it clicks to on duty.
Right.
Incidentally, that's why you see a lot of guys creeping along at 4 miles an hour on 285.
Right.
It's off duty. What it means is that you now have a time constraint as your primary determinant. So revenue per day is more critical since ELDs came in because, and I'll use an example of a Let's say I've got a 600-mile lane and I'm getting paid $2 a mile. That's $1,200. Well, if it delivers within 24 hours, I'm at $1,200 a day, which is about where I want to be. You know, if I'm $1,500 a day, maybe is where I need to be. If I'm a reefer carrier, maybe more. But you've got to focus on the revenue per day. So let's use that example of a 600-mile lane at $2 a mile. If it delivers next day, I'm good. But what if the broker is telling me it's a 2-day transit? Suddenly I'm down to $600 a day.
Right.
So it's not the rate per mile on its own anymore.
That's right.
Because pre-LDs, you can run the miles to catch up. Now it's the time constraint, it's the dock delays, it's traffic, it's all of the other things that eat up your 14-hour clock or your 60 or 70 hours in the total week. The clock is ticking.
Right.
So you've now got to be very selective about the lanes you run and the delivery window. Because you've got to, you know, if you do 600 miles a day, that's great. Or the next step is a 1,200-mile haul. So you've got to do it in blocks of days, unless you're getting a higher rate per mile to do that 2-day transit. So that's where revenue per day gets you to where you need to be. Whereas if you focus on rate per mile on longer delivery windows, you'll end up behind with your revenue targets.
Okay. And we've talked a lot about carriers needing to know their costs.
Right.
And so this focus on revenue per day is truly the best way you can sort of enter into a down market and try to stay profitable.
Right now, probably never more so than ever in any freight market cycle, because diesel's so high. Diesel's your biggest cost by far. Slowing down, idling less. It's going to be hard in summer, but it was a lot easier to do in winter when you could turn your idling down or run your engine at 600 RPM instead of 1200 when you're idling on your 10-hour break. You'd save a lot of money by idling lower or just not idling at all.
Right.
Now, that'll be really hard to do. It's hard to do in winter if you're worried about fuel gelling, if you haven't got anti-gel treatments in your tanks. But cost control is, I think, the critical component of running a business in the next quarter, because it's going to be hard to get revenue up because rates are still coming down. Although bottoming out, cost control is where margins are going to be.
When you talk about cost control, and I've heard this before, do you focus on speed?
Yep.
If you're managing a truck and your drivers, are you looking at the ELDs and are you making sure? Is that something you definitely have your eye on?
Absolutely. ELDs tell you what lanes are not profitable, because you can look at the average road speed in each hour for each lane. So ELDs have a plethora of data that can tell you about how profitable certain trucks are, certain lanes are, certain customers are. ELDs are the smallest part of it is the compliance piece. You can tell a lot about, you know, how fast trucks move between markets based on the GPS positioning data. So speed is I always say to drivers, it's not linear speed. It's not, you know, how fast you go. It's how many miles you do in each hour.
Right.
So I can do 600 miles a day and sit on 65 to 70 miles an hour all day. Be safe. There's 11 states you can run 75. But if I'm not a good mile maker and I stop at truck stops and my truck can run 85, I'm still behind.
Right.
Because it's not about the speed, it's about how many miles you do in each hour. And that is trip planning, good rest, good habits, you know, being a good mile maker. There's some folks, when you drive trucks often enough, you will see trucks blast past you in the hammer lane. Like you want to suck the doors off your truck. And then they'll pull over and you keep trucking along. And then next thing they're out around and they blow past you again. Sometimes this goes on all day. And what the carriers are doing is burning more fuel, higher maintenance costs. Whereas if they slowed down and were more diligent about how they trip planned and scheduled their breaks and their food, and they had more food cooked in their own sleeper and did all those sorts of good things, you would save a lot more money, because it's not about how fast you go. It's the miles in each hour. It's the productivity number.
Right.
That's absolutely critical. So that's where I always focus is on miles in each hour, not miles per hour.
Great, thank you. I know you've been very focused on safety in your career and have spoken about drivers and falling asleep at the wheel. Can we talk a little bit about what your thoughts are around that and tips for that?
Yep. So again, remember, you can be 100% compliant with ELDs, but sound asleep at the wheel at the same time. Right. So the connection between compliance to what I'll call unsafe regulations and safety is dubious at best, because it's not about how many hours you work, it's when the work occurs. So it's time of day is a big part of that. What I focus on is it doesn't matter how many hours you've got to run if you've had really bad sleep. Now, I'll exclude sleep disorders like sleep apnea, which truckers have a higher probability of sleep apnea because of our lifestyle, smoking, drinking, all those sorts of things. It's the weight around the neck that becomes problematic. It's the first thing the doctor sees and says, neck size higher than 18, we're off for a sleep study.
Okay.
That's the scare these days, is because of our body mass index is problematic compared to normal population, and sleep studies could be detrimental to a carrier because you end up with a short medical card. I've got a 1-year card because we have higher blood pressure in our family. I used to have a 2-year card.
Okay.
But when I hit a certain age, they shorten my card. They might see, hey, you've got a higher risk of sleep apnea, we'll give you a 3-month card. So the CDL physical these days, it can be career-ending.
Wow.
If you don't look after your health. So things have changed a lot. It's harder to get your CDL, keep your CDL, and the sleep is a really important part of it. So I spend a lot more time teaching folks how to sleep in blocks of an hour and a half on their 10-hour break, as opposed to thinking sleep in a linear way, as in more is better. More can be worse.
Right.
So 7 hours is worse than 6, which sounds counterintuitive, but 6 hours is 4 sleep cycles. It's 4 hour-and-a-half blocks. And if any of you have ever woken up before the alarm clock this morning, or you wake up every hour and a half during the night, that's normal because your body's going through a deep sleep, light sleep, dream cycle. And that's how our body's designed. So when you sleep in blocks of an hour and a half, you get better quality rest, which makes you more alert at the wheel, and you do more miles in each hour because you're not stopping at a rest area because you're tired. So the sleep is actually so I've taught sleep classes. I've done about 600 sleep classes in the last 20 years, teaching drivers and their spouses and teenage kids how to sleep. Families are involved because they manage the sleep schedule at home. Right. Most drivers will say, that's great, but you don't know what I've got to deal with. So you've got to have the home involved. Studies that I've done on control groups and the sleep train groups, the guys that I teach how to sleep run about 10% more miles per week. Wow. Proven to run more miles. It's only 60 miles a day. It's not. That's like 1 or 2 rest areas less, right? Because you're making more miles in each hour. You can sit there and bang out the miles because you're more alert. You think better. So sleep is absolutely critical to all of this. I learned as a driver over the years of being sleep deprived and falling asleep at the wheel and running off the road, that if you don't get good quality sleep, you'll get sick. You'll want to leave the industry faster if you don't have an accident, and you just won't be productive.
Right.
You won't make the miles.
Sounds like we're going to have you back for one of these sleep trainings.
Love
just for our carriers, a full sleep training.
Love to do that anytime.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yep.
Dean, let's talk a little bit about equipment type. Do you think that going into 2023, it will be harder for different equipment types than others?
I do, because if you use the analogy of the rising tide lifts all boats, that hasn't been the case during the pandemic. So when the pandemic started, some commodities in the retail online space were booming, other commodities were tanking. So it depends on what freight you were skewed towards. If you were a carrier that was with retail freight, 2021 was a great year. But if you were a carrier, hauling something that wasn't in demand, maybe auto parts because they couldn't get enough supplies, volumes might have been down. Now, that is still going to be the case this year because largely driven by the housing, decrease in housing demand, higher interest rates. The housing market's really cooled off because the thing that drove our 2021 economy the most, especially during the economic recovery, was housing, because a lot of folks bought new homes, built new homes, renovated new homes, moved to new areas with more tech-enabled houses to work from home.
Yes.
They were different homes. So that meant a lot more lumber, shingles, a lot more electrical appliances, a lot more furniture. Furniture was our number one import by a factor of 2 compared to our next import from overseas. Most of that came from Asia. So the housing boom really drove a lot of our activity in late 2020 and 21, even into early 22. That has cooled right off. So I say that because if you're a flatbed carrier, last year was great. This year won't be so good if you've got a heavy exposure to dimension framing lumber or roofing shingles. But if you're a flatbed carrier that's got an exposure to steel, the infrastructure bill will help boost a lot more plate that's going to be used in bridges. or railings, gravel, asphalt, chemicals, all those things are going to be needed to build new roads and bridges. So it really depends on the commodity you're hauling and the trailer type you've got and how specialised you are with all your extra equipment on the trailer or in the trailer as to what demand will look like. It's very specific. So my best advice to carriers is the most important thing you've got to understand is the demand for what you haul. You have to know what the consumer demand is for the freight that goes in your trailer. Because if you don't know that, it's hard to get ahead of the game because you don't know where to position your truck.
Right.
Good example, reefer carriers, strawberry season's coming online in Plant City, Florida. The Strawberry Festival is going to be on soon. It's peak strawberry season. Right now is where you'd want to be thinking about your refrigerated trailer deep in Florida because strawberry season's coming online. Now, the extension of that is the massive rains in California has really affected the strawberry crop because they can't get into harvest. There's so much water and damage to what's there. So some of the demand for things like strawberries and blueberries will come from Mexico via the McAllen market, and Florida will head west, which is not how it normally moves. So that's how you've got to understand the market and all of the macro factors that are happening on the news and think, what does that mean for produce? What does it mean if the building industry is down and I haul lumber out of Oregon? What does that mean? I normally haul a lot of imports out of Los Angeles because it gets transloaded into my 53-foot van in the Ontario Inland Empire market. If volumes are down there, does that mean there's less demand for loads to Chicago or Oklahoma or Dallas? Yes. So you've got to understand all of the things that are happening around the freight you haul. That's probably the most, other than knowing your operating costs, you've got to know that. And that is very trailer specific. So I've got good friends that run, drop deck, low profile tyre trailers to haul machinery out of Baltimore. Well, they run, Baltimore, Quebec, out to PEI and back. Peak imports for machinery in Baltimore doesn't happen until March, right? So you've got to be thinking, because that's planting season is around the corner.
Right.
So that's when all of the big machinery imports come into Houston, Galveston, Baltimore. So you've got to know about planting season's a big deal for flatbed carriers that have drop decks. That's because they can haul a lot more machinery with vertical clearance requirements. So you've got to really understand what you haul and the demand for it, and then you can figure out where you need to run, what lanes you need to run. Then you figure out your revenue per day, and then you come down to your rate per mile discussion.
And I know we've talked a little bit about your show. It's on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern time, where you do a market forecast. Right. And when you're talking about produce season and as a reefer preparing for that, or as a flatbed in steel or lumber, do you provide hints or do you talk about the market and where to go and where to put your truck?
I don't say specifically where to put your truck, but I infer that rates are strong in a particular market. So I might talk about Fresno to Boston. Right. Rates are up because volumes are up, or volumes are down because of the rain. Volumes are strong out of Laredo because we've got more imports coming through. So I talk about different markets, but not necessarily about giving advice about where you should put your assets, because I really don't know where all the carriers are running and what they need to be running for. But we do talk about the show when we break down. We've got 135 freight markets we study. And every Sunday we crunch all the numbers for the week prior. Right. And we map our rate data from our contributions that come in from all of our subscribers to what's happening in the market. Right. And we look at the rates and say, rates are going up from Lakeland to Los Angeles because produce is running because there's no rains in Florida, but there's plenty of rain out there. So we look at those sorts of things and help people connect the dots. Good. So that's we kind of tell a story around the data, and that might give some people some insights on what to be doing. Wonderful.
What advice do you have for the owner operator, small trucking company that has a few close relationships with, David and Sarah and Megan at their 3PL brokerage, and they typically get their freight through those, handful of relationships, thinking that they're getting the best rates. What would your advice be to that carrier?
I think there's a lot of tools out there where you can benchmark what the rates are on lanes. I think I wouldn't rely on social media. It's the first thing I wouldn't do. Okay. But that's a data point you've got to pull in. but you've got to weigh it with your own scales. And that means you've got to have pretty good objective historical data, which we've got in RateView. There's some ways to figure out what the rate should be on that lane other than phoning a friend, because you might not always get the right data. It's good to look at the last year historically and say that's where the rates are. That's where I think I need to be, at a minimum, pitching my bid for that lane. So I would say if it's not working for you and you're not getting that, then maybe you need to widen your scope and talk to other 3PLs or brokers.
I might argue that they think it is working for them.
Right.
But what they don't realize is that they're leaving money on the table that if they were working with someone else, or does the broker truly have the best interest of the carrier in that moment to pass on a fuel surcharge?
Right.
You know,
it's quite possible. So this comes down to your relationships and how much you trust the folks. How you know if it's a good rate is if your revenue per day is where it needs to be.
Right.
So that's I would say
going back to revenue per day.
If your revenue per day is less than where it needs to be, if it's like 900 a day and you need 1,200, maybe you're getting lowballed. So that's where you got to know your costs, revenue per day, and be a really good negotiator. And also, if you're doing the same thing as everybody else, you're probably doing the wrong thing.
Right.
So I always try to be different. You got to look for, there's a saying that there's no one home at the average, right? The opportunities are in the outliers.
That's right.
That's where you go. You go to where people aren't looking. Like if there's a massive snowstorm in a market and carriers are not going there, I'm going there, right? Because rates are going to come up on the way out.
Right.
So you've got to know what you're doing to do that. You've got to be experienced and savvy enough and have the right equipment. But that's where the opportunities are. And it's not necessarily on the high volume lanes. It's thinking differently about different lanes. And it comes back to knowing about consumer demand. Or there's a massive warehouse just been built in North Platte.
Right.
It's knowing what's being built. As you drive around, you're seeing all these warehouses pop up in Pennsylvania. That's telling you that there's a lot more freight going to be within 24 hours delivery of the whole eastern seaboard, right? So thinking about not just driving past warehouses, but the development of them around places like Phoenix. It means more outbound freight in a backhaul market. So looking at those sorts of things is how you think differently about the market and not doing the same thing as everyone else. I've never done that. I've always looked differently. My truck was always different. My presentation was always immaculate because that's the first thing people see. It's even how you speak on the phone is really, really important. So even when you talk to brokers, it's how you communicate. I would spend a disproportionate amount of time on communication skills, negotiating skills.
Right.
Once I know my operating costs, then I've got to know how to ask the right question if I'm a carrier.
Well, I think that's where the carrier struggles. They think if I don't take this load, then they're going to go find someone who will, versus feeling comfortable and confident enough to ask for a higher rate.
Right.
And because of the service that they know that they can offer, that the broker is not going to want to look for someone else. And I think that's that relationship piece where you do have to have the confidence to negotiate higher and saying the revenue per day, I cannot do this because I know that this, I cannot make my numbers.
So sometimes you might have to take that load, right? But again, if you know your costs and your revenue per week target, you know you can catch up on the second or the third load.
Okay.
That's what you've got to know. So sometimes you do need to keep moving because your fixed costs are going to be there if you sit.
Great point.
So sometimes you've got to keep moving, but you've got to know the damage that's doing to your bottom line by taking that load. So you might say, that's a low rate. I'll take it because I'm a good carrier and my service level's high. And I'll be there on time and I won't blow things up. Not literally, but I won't have a service failure. Right. So they will say, okay, that's good, but you owe me one. Right. So you've got to have a really good relationship to do that. But you've also got to know if you're taking that load into another market, you've got to know what that market is before you accept it. So that's where you've got to understand the macroeconomic conditions. You look at our market condition index and you'll say, that's a hot market where I'm going to, even though the rates are low, it's a good market to go into. Higher probability I'll get a good rate, but an even higher probability I won't sit. Right. It's the time that I burn. That's the opportunity cost number you've got to watch. Is not the rate per mile, but you need to get loaded out straight away.
Great. Dean, I want to ask about box trucks. I think box trucks, from for, in my opinion, is the biggest anomaly. They're not all created equal. They're not all as successful as others. How do you, it's a lower barrier to entry to purchase a box truck and get into the market. How do you become a successful box truck carrier?
It's the same as if I've got a drop deck trailer with, 6-foot drop tarps and straps and chains. I'm highly specialised, and I've got ramps on the back, by the way, to drive your machinery on. So it's about how specialised you are. It's the same with a box truck. Do you have a lift gate? What's your load securement like? You have a white glove service. How do you present yourself? So it's not just a small box truck. You've got to think about, how do I differentiate myself in a very crowded market?
That's right.
It's an overcrowded market right now, because so much more warehouse space has moved closer to urban populations. A lot more online purchasing is sort of sticking, so we've got a lot more freight being delivered in smaller trucks. It's also a good job for drivers. They can get paid reasonably well compared to over-the-road guys and be home every night.
That's right.
But I will say it's a hard job. I've done this in Sydney, Australia. It's a really stressful job, delivering a couple of hundred packages a day. It's a really stressful job. So you've got to have that mindset, be able to handle traffic and bad car drivers. But I would say it's about how you think about it. You've got to be totally prepared for all of that. But I would think about your equipment. How specialised are you? Do you have a lift gate, a pallet jack, a pallet truck? I think you call it. Like, so do you have? Packing blankets, straps, all those sorts of things. I would think about that, and even right down to, you're going to think about a refrigeration motor on your box truck, to haul pharmaceuticals if you're going to specialise in that niche.
Right.
So I think my advice would be, find the market that's where there's a niche that you can specialise in, that's underserviced, service the heck out of it.
Great.
So it's not just box trucks for anything. It's about a very specialised niche you've got to find.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to ask you about probably one of the most controversial questions or debates in trucking. Is there a driver shortage?
Oh, no, never has been. Now, there is a shortage of drivers who want to make trucking a career.
Okay.
There's a big distinction there. The industry has typically done a poor job at taking it from a job to a career. We don't do a good job at that as an industry. It's a hard job. There's a high attrition rate. I don't think the industry's got a shortage problem. There has never been, well, with the exception of the pandemic, when training schools closed down, there was a genuine shortage of people coming through schools for that sort of treadmill that we get on, where we hire drivers and then they leave within about 90 days.
Right.
So most of the new entrants that come into the industry, the highest turnover rate's about the 90-day mark. A lot of girls go through that and they say, hey, this is not for me. I'm not making the money. I'm away from home. I'm getting 1 day home for every week out.
Right.
And sometimes they don't send me home. I don't get home. It's a really hard job. But for a lot of people wanting to get their CDL, that was the normal path. You go to a training school with a large fleet, stay there a year, and then your goal is always to get the next job closer to home. When you become more regional, dedicated, local, so you're home every night but still making pretty good money. During the pandemic, that changed because you could get your CDL and people would put you through schools to work regionally and local because there's so much more freight moving in that final mile space.
Right.
So I think that model's changed. It'll be very hard for large truckload carriers to find drivers and keep drivers. I think the driver shortage will be very specific to a segment of the industry. I don't think there's a shortage because how do you run 100% driver turnover for 25 years that I've lived here,
right,
and have a shortage? There's no shortage of people to fill out an application.
Right.
There hasn't been. There's a problem with retention. So the industry struggles with how to retain drivers. That's the biggest issue they've got. So I don't buy the narrative of there's a net shortage. I just don't think that doesn't make sense to me based on any of the numbers I look at. But is there a shortage of folks who want to make it a career? Absolutely. The population has changed. So there's a lot of people retired during the pandemic.
Right.
The bulk of the people that made up the truckload industry, sort of the post-Vietnam vet era, that bubble of drivers, that baby boom generation is getting older and retiring. They retired at an accelerating rate during the pandemic. So you've actually got less working people available in the total pool.
Right.
So, and of course the newer generation driver wants to be home. So, we hire our own problems most of the time because we hire a driver that wants to be home often, yet we're going to send him away over the road.
Well, if there's any positive to that, the younger driver hopefully is more technology,
More tech savvy.
tech savvy and open to that. And certainly we could argue trucking has been so far behind from a tech perspective. And so
it's still it's actually turned into a really good paying job for a lot of those guys that make that leap. It's still very hard physically and mentally, but the wage rises, for the last 3 years that have made this a good paying job. So I think for carriers, drivers wanting to enter the industry, there's still a great opportunity. I mean, I've been involved all my life. It's a wonderful industry, plenty of opportunity. So pay is pretty good right now. Carriers can't claw that back. But when you take away all of the other things, you've got the emotional and the physical stuff you've got to deal with. It's a really hard job and often a thankless job.
I literally was just going to say, and so thankless. Like I do wish if there was one message I could spread, it would be that the country as a whole should be more appreciative of drivers and carriers and all that they do to keep the country running. And, it's wild to me that they are not put more on a pedestal for what they do for us.
It's like when you drive 285 here in Atlanta, right? You see, trucks tailgating other cars. Like, so the name's on the side of the truck. Car drivers are going to cut in, back off.
Right.
So I see, we, the truck industry, we got to clean up our own backyard first. Just look at any rest area and look at the waste that's thrown out of trucks. Right? ELDs have caused drivers to take more risks, drive faster, and cut more people off, especially other truck drivers, because they've got a finite number of hours to do the miles now.
Right.
So they're rushing more. So that's why accidents haven't improved with ELDs, because we've got people trying to do more in a certain window of time. So I think behaviour's changed. The pandemic has certainly affected a lot of folks. And it's one of the things that truckers tell me is when the industry started to open up and people went back to work, something had changed. The way they drove on the road had changed dramatically. It was like people forgot how to drive. Right. So the behaviour on the road has changed a lot. Social media's had a lot to do with that. A lot of people are doing crazy stuff just to get clicks on a social media, like the famous brake check that people do for pulling in front of trucks, and that's a pretty dangerous thing to do. So there's lots of stuff going on the road that makes it a really hard job as it is. But I think carriers have got to be very careful. They have a job to do too in how they behave on the roads. I drive on the roads all the time. I see my fellow drivers doing stuff that I would never imagine doing as a professional driver. And you can't communicate because they haven't got a CB radio. Right. Because it's not considered a safety device in a truck. So,
Dean, your opinion on CB radios?
Must have.
Okay.
They're a safety equipment. They'll save your life in particular in winter. I don't know how a lot of guys drive in winter without a CB radio. But the CB radio runs a little bit deeper in terms of why we've got so few people wanting to make trucking a career.
Right.
Because go back to the 70s where we had Hollywood was big into movies with Chris Christopherson, Burt Reynolds, you had Smokey and the Bandit, Convoy, Jewel, BJ and the Bear.
Yeah.
The BJ and the Bear truck is at every truck show I go to.
Right.
So those things that happened in the 70s and 80s were a great inducement for people to join the industry because there were movies made about the romance and the excitement and the lifestyle that came out of the post-deregulation era. But we don't have Hollywood making any movies anymore about, glamorizing the truck driver.
No.
So we have lost that sort of glamour of people wanting to join the trucking industry. That's changed a lot. The CB radio was the architect of a lot of that era because it was the primary way people communicated.
Right.
Especially Convoy, right? There's been songs written about it. So I'd like to see the CB radio come back as being a permanent piece in a truck. I talked to an OEM the other day and they said it's an option when they buy new trucks, but most carriers are asking for that as an install option, which is good news. That
is great news. I was in traffic just, a few weeks ago and everything had stopped. And I honestly thought about getting up and going immediately to the truck in front of me and asking what's on the CB radio.
They would know.
But then it occurred to me that not everyone has one anymore, and I thought that would be a dying,
Yeah, it's hard. So a lot of guys you call up on the CB radio and there's no answer.
Right.
Sometimes they don't want to listen because there's too much chatter, too much nasty talk, too much bitterness, or too many people just out there at home trolling truck drivers as you drive through. There's a bunch of people that do that.
Wild.
And if you have a CB on, like that could last for 20 miles if they've got a good receiver or a good booster on their end. So I understand why some people don't do it, but I just think it's something it's part of your DNA. You've got to have it.
Dean, parts. So many of our clients this past year have struggled. They've got repairs and maintenance issue, and they're sitting far longer than they ever have to get those resolved. Any idea on relief or when we'll see parts and maintenance kind of come back to normal?
I think generally speaking, it's starting to normalize. So the supply chain is starting to ease. The disruptions are starting to ease. It still hasn't worked its way through its natural course. So we've still got delays on some parts. The bigger issue is labour. So I think people are still finding it hard to find qualified technicians.
Right.
There's been a shortage of technicians for years, but the pandemic made that a lot worse. People are still getting sick and staying away from work. So there's still that going on in the workplace. I would say it's getting better, but we're still not there yet. But you're still going to see delays in big dealerships where you've got warranty work. I think that's because they're finding it very hard to find enough technicians that know what they're doing that can fix it first time out, not have you back 3 or 4 times before the problem's solved. So there's still a skill level issue, on top of there's just not enough people in that industry.
That's right.
So I think we're paying a lot more and we're spending a lot longer. I think they're 2 things that will stay.
Right.
But the parts shortage will probably become a smaller issue over time.
Certainly great opportunity in trade schools for diesel mechanics and, going into that field.
I've had to force myself to become one to do maintenance on my own truck.
Right.
And I loathe maintenance, but I've had to because I can't get people. They're either not accepting new customers, they can't fit you in, or it'll take 3 days.
Right.
And none of those are acceptable. So I think a lot of folks that are not tech savvy, and the social media's been wonderful because there's always a video on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram on how to do what you're thinking about doing.
That's right.
I swapped out an alternator the other day on my Caterpillar, and I just went online and there was a guy in a truck stop swapping out a C16 Caterpillar.
Right.
It's like nuts. And I just watched it. I can do that. And it worked. So
nice.
Social media is wonderful for that.
It is. It is. Well, Dean, any final thoughts for our clients, for our carriers, for everyone who's listening and curious about what the year should unfold, how it should unfold?
Yeah, I think you've got to be focused more on the business of being in business, less on driving. You've got to really, there's never been a more important time to understand the industry you're in, but understand the broader macroeconomic climate that your truck runs in. You've really got to understand that because that's where the opportunities are. But if you don't understand that, then you're always chasing the rate per mile.
Right.
You're always playing catch up.
Right. Thank you, Dean. Again, your show airs every Tuesday at 10 a.m. on YouTube. It's DAT's Market Update.
DAT IQ Market Update.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you, Dean. Appreciate you all, and drive safe.